Welcome to the UCSF-Stanford CERSI FDA Distinguished Speaker Series on Cybersecurity for Biomedical Engineering. My name is Kevin Fu, and I'll be your host today as we talk about medical device security. A disclaimer, this seminar series does not represent official FDA policy or guidance. The contents are those of the speakers and do not necessarily represent the official views of, nor an endorsement by, FDA, HHS, or the US government. This seminar is recorded. I'm your host and moderator today, and you can read more about me here on my LinkedIn profile. I'm a professor at Northeastern University in electrical computer engineering, the Curry College of Computer Sciences, and bioengineering. A couple of announcements before we begin with our speaker today. First, FDA wants to hire you. If you're interested in a career in cybersecurity at the FDA, contact diane.mitchell@fda.hhs.gov. Well, why are we here today? Well, there are no shortage of news headlines about security risks to medical devices. Cybersecurity is very important for biomedical engineering today. There's been legislation that has been passed, most recently, to require security review of medical devices. Now, cybersecurity is required in statute rather than by non-binding guidance. The FDA has also recently released its new pre-market guidance document, and it has been finalized: Cybersecurity in Medical Devices, Quality System Considerations, and Content of Pre-Market Submissions. This is effectively the process that reviewers will follow now during pre-market stages when evaluating the cybersecurity case of a request to market a medical device in the US market. We've had a number of past distinguished speakers in this series, and it's my pleasure today, however, to introduce today's speaker, Andrew Carney. He is a program manager at ARPA-H. ARPA-H is the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Health, and he is going to participate today in a fireside chat on ARPA-H and the DIGIHEALS program. The Digital Health Security Program initiative supports innovative research that aims to protect the U.S. healthcare system's electronic infrastructure against hostile threats. Focusing on cutting-edge security protocols, vulnerability detection, and automatic patching, DIGIHEALS seeks to reduce the ability for bad actors to attack digital health software and hardware and to enable the prevention of large-scale cyber attacks. Today, it is my pleasure to welcome Andrew to this fireside chat. All right. Well, thank you, Andrew Carney, for joining the program for the CERSI program, the joint FDA CERSI program on cybersecurity for biomedical engineering. It's so great to have you on the program to talk about ARPA-H and the DIGIHEALS program. And I thought we could just begin with, maybe you could tell our audience of biomedical engineers and students and faculty and industry and government a little bit about ARPA-H, and then we'd love to learn a little bit more about the DIGIHEALS program.
Fantastic. Thanks, Kevin. So ARPA-H is modeled after the other ARPAs, DARPA, ARPA-E, which is effectively a high-risk, high-reward research agency that is intended to sort of explore the space that existing commercial activity and more traditional research outlets aren't hitting for whatever reason. Our mandate is effectively to improve the healthcare outcomes for all Americans. How we do that is entirely up to the program managers. We aren't actually focused on any specific disease, any specific condition. We're sort of given this kind of broad remit, if you will, and then it's up to us to sort of find the problems that we think will have the most impact if we solve them.
Well, it must be exciting to have this, sort of the first stage of things getting started, especially when there are so many problems to solve in healthcare cybersecurity. And it sounds like, I know in your background coming from sort of defense and things of that nature, and what elements can be brought to healthcare. But I'm curious if maybe you could tell us a little bit about first the DIGIHEALS program, what specifically that's looking to really charge performers, and then we can talk about how it connects with some of your interests and your background.
Fantastic. So the Digital Health Security, or DIGIHEALS initiative, was designed to transition technology designed for defense use cases, which can be relatively niche in the security space. Even those that seem like they might have kind of straightforward defensive applications, oftentimes just the particulars, like for the general sort of population or just more commodity sort of compute environments. There are either scaling issues or there are implementation issues that, because they weren't designed with this case in mind, you hit a snag, you hit a wall. So we sort of identified a number of potential technologies that we knew would be impactful if we could transition them into the healthcare space. And so we put out DIGIHEALS was intended as a call to this sort of performer base that's primarily defense industrial, and sort of get the folks that have already done good work in that space thinking about healthcare and transitioning their work into healthcare, and also the folks that are already kind of bridging the gap in one way or another, whether it's in academia or industry, to sort of also come to the table and sort of help us with the transition stories and help us with their sort of experience and wisdom about kind of engaging in cybersecurity for healthcare.
Yeah, well, there's so many challenges in healthcare cybersecurity, as I'm sure you're well aware. Where to even begin? So, what are some of the programs that have recently gotten started? Tell us a little bit about what's the first wave.
Yeah, so we've got a few efforts funded already. You can read about them on the website in addition to what we talk about here. One of the ones I'm excited for all of them, but the first one that sort of jumps to mind has to do with SBOM, which has been sort of...
for our audience, I mean, many know what SBOMs are, but perhaps let's define it.
Sure. SBOM is Software Bill of Materials, and this is a way of characterizing and describing the software that actually goes into a system, so that both either the consumer or the sort of middleware or third-party kind of developer knows what they're importing or knows what they're sort of bringing into their product or their hospital. So I think the multiple federal agencies have been focused on the value and sort of how the thought of what an SBOM could be would be beneficial. I realize that sounds a little maybe overcomplicated. I think on the implementation side, it's a very complicated, ideally, the SBOM would actually use the behavior of the software, the characterization of what the software does, I think, to describe sort of its components. In addition to the lineage, the authors, the sort of where it comes from. I think what it does is just as, if not more important. And there are elements that are capturing that in a manner that's useful, even to the initiated, is challenging. When we look at sort of program analysis for, I come from a reverse engineering background, and most of what we do when we're reverse engineering with the intention of sort of identifying security defects, most of it is program understanding. Most of it is understanding what the program does. So I think in my mind, ideally an SBOM would give us the high points of that sort of characterization and describe to us what the piece of software is doing, in addition to all the other things that sort of many current SBOM sort of approaches have incorporated. There's also the issue of assertion versus, fact. And if you look at the metadata inside a DLL, or you look at the
you said an acronym, DLL.
Sorry, dynamically linked library. So if you look at metadata for code generally that talks about the author or talks about the version, identifying that a version has changed is an important thing to note. In addition to that, it would be great if we also knew what that change meant. Mm-hmm. And I think it's really depending on the development team, depending on the product, minor and major version numbers can mean very different things.
Oh yeah, or even in a Unix operating system like glibc.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
what version is here, and
Yeah.
which grad student wrote it 10 years ago, and what country?
Right? The pedigree of the software is complicated, and I think in an effort to make SBOMs sort of mainstream viable for use, there's been we've necessarily had to pull back on some of the more complicated elements of it. So it's a very long way of saying, one of the things on DIGIHEALS that we're doing is trying to bridge that explainability and program analysis gap to actually characterize what the software is doing using at first static analysis, but hopefully dynamic analysis passes as well. And then translate that technical jargon into language that is useful to a hospital administrator, someone doing procurement. So they may understand what's good and bad in this space. They may know the words to they may know what they're looking for, but if we just give them, after this minor version, the software now allocates read, write, execute memory, and writes user data to it, this is not super helpful. That's
too in the weeds.
Technically correct, but not very helpful.
Well, I find it interesting because through the FDA regulatory lens, there's the SBOM focus is specific on regulated medical devices, things that are therapeutic or diagnostic through the 510K process or PMA and other regulatory pathways. But it sounds like your vision is a little broader than that, since ARPA-H is not a regulator, and it's broader than just an FDA. So there are other devices, I would imagine, in a hospital you're thinking about that are not regulated medical devices, or what are some things you're imagining that these SBOMs are relevant to in your mind for this advanced research beyond medical devices?
I mean, I think in an ideal world, anything with compute in it would be fair game. That all the way down to the mechanical, electrical, plumbing, systems.
So like health records, are those in?
So the application layer? Absolutely. I think really, it's maybe a little bit of a cop-out answer, but every level, it doesn't, given the attack surface of any sort of large organization. So I worked at HSBC for a bit, and in their global cyber operations office. And HSBC is a gigantic organization. There were lots and lots of sites to protect, over 1 million devices at any given time that we had to manage. But most of them were some flavor of Windows VM or Linux VM or Windows Server or laptop, or we could categorize them relatively effectively. In the healthcare space, there's a much more diverse sort of field of things that you have to both identify and then sort of figure out how best to protect them. And so I think approaching the SBOM problem from a general it doesn't matter what the platform is, it doesn't matter what software it's running, we need to be able to say something about it. And the more we can say, the better. Is for me, that feels like the right version of the problem. And honestly, it's in many ways a hard form of the problem, if not the hardest.
And so with I don't want to have the whole time talk about SBOMs, but it's hard to resist because it's just become such an important topic. But I know there's a lot of development going on the tooling. I think the industry is expecting to see the tooling evolve over time, and we don't know all the answers, but we do know some of the salient benefits, like the risk calculus, better being able to know when there's a vulnerable component, how to more quickly and systematically, not run around with your head cut off, but actually focus on the devices that do have risk. So I believe you have a couple projects now that are just getting started. Is that right? What kind of elements related to SBOM are they looking at roughly?
So the static analysis I mentioned, the explainable sort of static analysis, one of our efforts is really focused on that. It's both getting a better sense for the field, starting with more mainstream kind of like Windows, core Windows software, and then starting there and then sort of developing a language or models to express the changes that you might see in a code base in a way that would be useful to folks that aren't necessarily developers or researchers. That's very excited for that group.
Okay. Well, so SBOM, just one part of healthcare security. There's a litany of others. I mean, we haven't yet heard the R word yet in this conversation. And by the way, this is the first in-person CIRSE event. So cheers. Cheers. Yeah, we just happened to be next to each other, so we decided why do it over Zoom. But the R word, ransomware.
Ransomware, yeah.
So what's going on with ransomware in healthcare? Is that solved?
I wish it were.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think ransomware highlights a lot of the sort of biggest gaps that we have. I mean, in any industry that's hit by it, it really highlights the gaps that we have in sort of our perimeter, our sort of defensive posture. The adversaries here are intelligent. They're very skilled. They're very motivated, and so it's the non-consensual red teaming none of us asked for, right? Like it's like
yeah.
And I think in from my perspective, the threat actors that we're dealing with are, if you forgive the analogy, it's sort of like they're an NBA basketball team that we are playing on sort of a high school court with, and that if we up our game, like where they currently sort of succeed, if we close off those avenues, there's a whole lot of headroom for them to up their game. And so I think we have to anticipate the escalation on top of fixing sort of the issues and the gaps that we see currently. And I think doing that in a manner, in an effective way, without going broke, it's going to be a challenge. It's going to continue to be a challenge. So I think we have to be really smart about where there's the holes that we patch first, and sort of how we allocate our effort in tackling these problems.
And with the healthcare environment, it's so heterogeneous. It's hard to imagine sort of where to start, because you tweak this button and there's 50 more buttons, or other products or things in the clinic. So where does one start, or on the research side at least? What are some of the technical approaches to think about?
So I think industry is really focused on the perimeter problem, and so that's there's a lot the products. There are a lot of mature products in that space. Whether or not they do what they claim to do is a different question. But I think that area is, it's also sort of easier to work in because you can kind of ignore the environment that you're protecting to a point, right? You can see NetFlow, but you don't actually need to know the version of the firmware on the device that is creating that NetFlow to look at that NetFlow. So I think coming from the defense space, where automated program analysis is a huge sort of focus of sort of vulnerability research generally, making that technology more widely available, more useful to sort of integrate into, whether it's the development life cycle, or even make it more useful for the red teams and the blue purple teams that are sort of out there.
Or glass box testing.
Absolutely. I think automated program analysis helps us expose, much like with the SBOM, it lets us really touch the root of the vulnerability or the defect, and sort of helps us, lets us push through the symptoms, if you'll forgive the sort of analogy. And so the talent pool, I mean, expert reverse engineers tend to be expensive. The talent pool is not large. It's hard to grow. So automation, better automation, more useful automation, especially automation that considers the sort of the human in the loop, the human that they're
automation for testing or using the tools to find solutions. So what kind of automation are we talking about here? What variety? Oh, all varietals.
So I think from a developer standpoint, enabling better use of static and dynamic analysis in your dev pipeline is a huge thing. I mean, today, if it's not offered as part of your CI, your continuous integration platform, and you don't understand how any of those tools work, that's a huge lift for you to incorporate that into sort of your build process.
And for our audience that consists of many biomedical engineers who might have a compiler background, sort of static analysis is stuff you can do by just analyzing the code, in the back room or looking at the software. But dynamic analysis, you have to have a running system to actually evaluate. So in real time.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And so for so I think making it, and I think once again, industry has done more in the let's add DAST and SAST, like dynamic analysis as a service or static analysis as a service testing, to some of the platform offerings, but it's still not sort of, it should be default. Like it should be just part of the how we develop software well.
Yeah. I myself am a little wary of dynamic because sometimes I find the solutions are worse than the problem. So short story, there was a time when we were all told by companies and universities, you must install an antivirus scanner. And if you would think it would make you more secure, but the students discovered that every night the antivirus scanner would go to an unauthenticated FTP website, download a tarball, untar it, decompress it, and just execute it as root. Mm-hmm. And so they were able to get root on all these Macs through the security solution, right? And so you can imagine splicing things into dynamic. I know with medical devices, many manufacturers are hesitant to install antivirus products because sometimes they can run amok and sort of play with memory management. And do you really want that running at the same time as radiation therapy, control logic? The way forward is how to get probably to work. And at least with the research environment, I suppose you can do sort of these early steps without some of the patient safety issues coming to the forefront while sort of working out the kinks.
Absolutely. I mean, the patient safety remains kind of at the forefront of our minds, both as part of the security problem that we're solving and as something to be mindful of as we test. I think especially for anything that's implanted, obviously, and to their credit, I think the device manufacturers have really, just from talking to them over the past few months and looking at the work product that's been evolving over the past few years, that FDA and the device manufacturers have really made huge strides in sort of how they think about security and how they incorporate it into a lot of these devices. But there are emergent sort of complexities and issues when we start thinking about hospitals or just large systems in general. And so things that may not have been an issue in isolation suddenly may compound to create vulnerable conditions as we start combining all these devices together, which is less of an issue on a server farm where everything may be sort of a clone of the same VM. They're all running on similar hardware, but in a hospital, if we're talking about tens or hundreds of custom architectures running different flavors of different operating systems, and all interacting with one another in a way that is both very where them working is the most important thing, right? Like if you have a patient that is relying on a device, that device just needs to do its job, and sort of I can completely see why sort of every other element of that device might fall by the wayside if you're really focused on patient care and patient sort of the quality of their outcome. And I think that's I think it's very reasonable to sort of really hyper focus on how does this help me save a patient? How does this help me improve someone's life? And sort of,
I think through the FDA lens, often the phrase that is used in regulated devices would be essential clinical function, making sure those essential clinical functions remain safe and effective, closely related to the patient outcomes, of course.
That makes sense. So I think we can be very thoughtful about the devices, once again, sort of in isolation. But as we start combining them, sort of the sort of not unpredictable, but I haven't yet seen a sort of hospital level range, like a really like expansive sort of an environment to test technologies, whether they're devices or additional sort of defensive or like cyber protection kind of schemes, at the scale that we would ideally like to do for our large healthcare delivery organizations. And that's something where when we go back into the defense space, there's been a lot of work on that, right? I mean, the services have their own variants of cyber test ranges. And when we would look at systems and try to identify how to best defend them, it was assumed. We didn't even have to talk about like the fact that we needed to emulate as much of the system as possible so that maybe we weren't, even if there wasn't sort of like dynamic analysis testing running on the whole system, we could at least sort of test out theories and sort of attempt to, we were able to sort of, without going directly to a base or without recreating something completely in the real world, we could test on an emulated version that was, 80% of the way there, 90% of the way there. So I think that testing is something that I would really, that level of testing, like really high fidelity emulation across all of these devices, I think would be beneficial just in general.
I know some hospital systems will have complete buildings set up to sort of simulate a clinical environment. They're going to get some new patient monitors or drug infusion pumps, and they might put them into a room and have clinicians come through just to see what the workflow, clinical workflow is going to look like. But it would just get so much more complicated once you start asking the security questions. So which parts do you emulate? Which parts have to be in meat space, with real clinicians, potentially real patients?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think exploring that space and seeing what the value we start to get as sort of as we combine sort of clinical simulations with more of the security elements. Mm-hmm. We actually have a performer, another performer on DIGIHEALS. This is a clinician-led team, and this is something that they're looking at very closely. And sort of how you take clinical simulations and put doctors sort of in the hot seat for the unique sort of effects that can manifest with a cyber attack versus some other flavor of emergency or even disaster. It's its own flavor.
And how to scale that up from a single hospital to a country.
Yeah. That is a hard problem for sure.
So it sounds like part of the role, correct me if I'm wrong, that ARPA-H is trying to stimulate sort of industrial participation in commercialization and productization. So where does that fit in with sort of the puzzle of scaling up? What are some of the interesting roles of industry in helping with the ARPA-H mission?
I think industry has a lot of the capability to do the things to do many of the things that from a security research standpoint we would want to see done. And I think part of it is helping sort of making some of this more sort of archaic technology both accessible and then also making it the why, right? If you're asking someone to add some amount of time or money to their sort of testing cycle or production cycle, it's perfectly reasonable for them to want an explanation. I mean, this is where healthcare is a resource constrained, in some degree, zero-sum game, right? Every dollar we spend on IT is $1 less oftentimes than we spend on care. And so I think remaining cost conscious, regardless of sort of your position in the sort of industry or in the the domain, right? Whether you're a payer or you're a manufacturer, everyone is, I think, very reasonably so cost conscious. And so, when we talk about, I think making technology more accessible and then the explainability has an additional benefit to actually back into the security industry, in that even amongst like experienced practitioners, there are still sort of myths about the security mythology is an interesting kind of animal, in that you'll have widely held beliefs by groups of very intelligent people that do not stand up to scrutiny in one way or another. And I'm sure I'm guilty of this as well. I'm not claiming I'm not. But I think it helps us talk about and look at our own work better.
Well, maybe we'll take a question from the audience. Oh, what's that? Did you say just put that device on a secure hospital network? Tell us about that myth.
I think so for ransomware, I think it's something like 80% of all attacks are facilitated, or 80% of all attacks are facilitated by an unwitting insider. So it's something that they do that creates an insecure condition, but with no malice. Humans are extremely resourceful, clever creatures. If we need to get a thing done, like folks working in a hospital, they're going to find a way to do what they need to do. And I don't think it's reasonable for us to ask clinicians, nurses, any of these folks, we don't want to add to their cognitive load. We don't want them thinking about security. We want to make this entirely opaque to them, so they can focus on treating patients. And I think that desire, combined with the fact that their behavior creates a sense of, or reduces the security of the system in some ways, means that we really have to look at how we design the environment and the applications and tools that they're working with to sort of encourage and sort of like funnel them towards behaviors that are more secure.
Yeah, and I've seen so many well-meaning researchers propose security tools that, from a textbook perspective, are pretty sound. But then when you try to put it into clinical practice, the clinical workflow, it interrupts the clinical workflow. I'm imagining you've heard some stories of this nature. Wonderful technology, but has difficulty when actually reaching the real world.
Absolutely. I think I heard a doctor shared with me a story about a multi-factor authentication system that they were using, but was slow, and the app on their phones would just not work sometimes. And they discovered that there were hard-coded links that they could access to circumvent the MFA. And so, of course, even when their phones were working, they just stopped using the MFA because it was much faster to just go to these links that gave them access to the system that was supposed to be protected by the multi-factor authentication. And I honestly can't really blame them, right? Like, I don't know doing the math on how much time they saved versus, whatever spherical cow model for security we would calculate the insecurity that introduced. I don't know. I'm not going to speculate too much on the math on that, but in general, I think it's hard for me to fault experts for sort of trying to do what they're good at and what they've been hired to do in the face of a system that might not be as accommodating as it should be.
But one may have to accept the fact that there is no one person who's going to be trained in every one of these skill sets. You've got cybersecurity, you've got patient safety, medical device design, the workflow, risk management. You've got just a litany of different disciplines that are very rarely have worked together in the past.
Yeah.
So I find it really interesting of sort of the interdisciplinary nature of the program.
100%. I think I think throughout my career, I've seen really amazing things happen when we start trying to bring folks from different domains into the same room. Sometimes even one of the cleverest sort of human factors folks I know cut their teeth in industrial glasswork. And then they transitioned into network operations center and security operations center sort of human factors. And like I said, to date, they're one of the sort of, I learned something every time I talk to them, but their background is not cyber like focused at all, but they knew how to look at processes and look at how people interact with technology, and very quickly sort of cut to the quick of, you know, what was motivating them, where was the sort of like block, where was the, or you know, what is the efficiency that we can gain here. And so I think there are a lot of people with thoroughly applicable skill sets that may be in domains that we're just not even thinking of at all. I'm a colleague many years ago, we were talking about hiring reverse engineers, and they were musing on what if we took an editor? Like, do we think we could train an editor to actually do software code review? And the idea was they're already someone who's used to reading a lot of prose and sort of identifying errors both in syntax and semantics. How much work would it take to take an expert sort of newspaper editor or book editor and give them just enough knowledge to be able to find defects in code? It's very much a shower thought sort of, but I think the power of the interdisciplinary work, we have yet really to tap it in its entirety.
So we've got maybe another 5 minutes or so. One thing I wanted to move to was just how others from the biomedical engineering or the healthcare cybersecurity community can get involved. And the population is pretty diverse. It could be everywhere from, you know, principal investigators to students to industry. What are some ways or advice you might have to people in the audience about how to help contribute to the mission of ARPA-H or DIGIHEALS or other related programs? What are some suggestions you might have for them?
For starters, anything that we've talked about today, I can be reached at andrew.carney at arpa-h.gov. And if you have thoughts in the space, I'm happy to sort of start that conversation. We also have an open solicitation, our open BAA, broad agency announcement, that accepts submissions on anything healthcare related, but including cyber topics as well. And that is a short abstract that then creates a sort of conversation with a program manager about how that abstract might turn into a full effort. So the intention is for the abstract lift to be very small, that it's not a lot of effort, but that it can start that conversation and you can sort of put your idea on paper, and then we can start figuring out how to talk about it best and how to kind of, you know, make it a reality. I will have additional security-focused solicitations coming out in the next 4 to 12 months. So please keep an eye out for those. But our ARPA-H.gov, our team there does a great job, I think, at hitting all the social media outlets, and the site as well is just a really good one-stop shop for kind of everything that everything that's in any stage of solicitation or award is every effort, like every program effectively is on there just about as soon as it's become real in any sense of the word. And I would say also don't I really encourage folks. Thank you for bringing up the interdisciplinary note. I think that's a failure modality that I've seen over and over in my career, where teams of very well-intentioned, very intelligent people fail to appreciate the subtleties and details of a discipline that they are sort of stepping partially into. And so I'd really just encourage folks generally, talk to people outside of your domain, talk to clinicians or whoever in the healthcare space you want your work to impact. Have that conversation, bring them onto your teams. I think, we can do really amazing things if we start kind of working more like that. As sort of as much as possible.
Great. Well, I hope some of the audience is able to take that advice and get involved. We'll be closing out the session in just a few moments, but do you have any final words or any messages you'd like to leave with our audience and primarily biomedical engineering?
If you have an idea that you think is really good, but you won't get it published, give us a call for whatever reason.
All right. Well, thank you, Andrew, for joining the program. And it's so good to have you as our first in-person guest. And thank you again.
Thank you, Kevin.